Hello and welcome to this Dev Summit presentation, Practical Guide to ArcGIS Online Security. My name is Andrea Rosso. I'm a lead architect on ArcGIS Online. I'm presenting with Jeff Smith, who's a product engineer on our enterprise product. Today we'll talk about security as it pertains to ArcGIS Online. ArcGIS Online is our multi-tenant software as a service platform, which allows our customers to subscribe to a virtual portal where they can then upload and manage their information, disseminate it, analyze it, etc. As part of it being a multi-tenant system, there's various questions on how you can control your information, share it to the right people, and set up security in various ways to protect it. So that's part of what we'll talk about today. So in today's topics, we'll talk about the information model of the portal and basically the basics that you can control. A little bit about feature layer security, which often comes up as part of securing your information. We'll talk a little bit about encryption and HTTPS, about user administration and authentication within your portal or organization. And then we'll talk a little bit about integrating your applications with OAuth 2. If you are a developer that actually wants to use ArcGIS Online identities and provide extra functionality to users on the ArcGIS Online platform. A little bit more about some specific portal security settings that are important, and then a little bit about compliance and what we've done to sort of validate our platform. So the first thing to understand or to start with is our portal information model. So when you subscribe to ArcGIS Online, you get access to a portal. Within that portal, you can create your users. These are your named users in the system. Those users upload content or information, which we call items. And then they can also create groups, which allow you to share items with a specific set of users. So those are the four sort of basic things inside of the portal or your portal information model. As part of our APIs, since most of you are developers, as part of our APIs, these concepts are reflected in our backend APIs. We have a REST API that backs all our portal UIs that make use of this REST API. And then those REST APIs are then wrapped in various SDKs like the JavaScript API and the Android, iOS runtimes and so on. So there's various ways for you as a developer to leverage some of these concepts, and you'll see these same things in the API on the back end. So a little bit more detail about each one of these. So first of all, there's the portal. So when you subscribe to ArcGIS Online, you get a virtual portal. We sometimes call this an organization, sometimes your subscription, but they all refer to this concept. And your portal can either be public or private. So when you set up your portal, you actually set up a custom URL of your choosing, something.maps.arcgis.com. And then you can select whether it's public or private. So if it's public, anybody going to that URL will get a front page with what you put on it. You can describe what your organization does, maybe put some of your latest maps on it, etc. Or you can make it private. And so if anybody goes to that URL, they will get prompted to log in before they can actually do anything. The portal itself is also also has a REST backend concept. So I have an example here on the right where this is the URL that you would call to look up your particular portal. Every portal has an ID. So if you have access to this particular portal, you'll be able to get back all its properties via this REST call. Of course, if you use something like the JavaScript API or other runtime APIs or SDKs, you'll have a much kind of higher level or more well-wrapped object to interact with and use to get all of the properties of the portal, etc. Then within your portal, you have items. Items, as I've mentioned before, are kind of this generic term that we use for your information. As far as a developer is concerned, an item is a very generic thing. It's got the same API for anything that it is, but to the end user, there's different types of items. There's web maps, there's various services or layers, there's various types of data sets. So you could have PDF and CSV and shape files and file geodatabases, etc. Those are all different item types. There's about 140 or 150 items, different item types in the system currently. And whenever you upload this information as an item, it's private by default. So we don't automatically share it to anybody or make it public or anything. It's yours. It's owned by you, the owner, and it's private by default. And then you have to select to share it. So you can share it with groups of users so that they can also see it. You can share it to your entire organization or every user in your portal, or you can share it with everyone. And when we say with everyone on ArcGIS Online, we mean anonymous users who are coming to the ArcGIS Online site. So that means basically everybody on the internet. They can come in, they can search, they can find your item, and they can use it. So this is very desirable to disseminate information about latest events, emergencies, public information, etc. But of course, have to understand what you're doing if the information is more sensitive or just for your organization. Then there's users. Users are your named users within the system. They own items and groups. And users can create a profile for themselves so they can describe who they are, and that profile can be discoverable by either no one, the organization, or everyone. So the user can select whether they want to be private, basically, or public. And by doing that, it allows, let's say if they set themselves public, it allows anonymous users to find those users and see who they are, especially if they have public data sets, for instance. You might want to have a public profile so that you can explain who you are and what you do and why your data is maybe authoritative in some way. And users have a role. So the role defines what they can do. And so we have 5 different built-in roles currently that you can select from as part of the system. These are the administrator, which is basically your root user, your super admin that can do everything, can administer your whole entire organization or portal. You have a data editor that can do data editing. You have a publisher who can publish hosted feature layers. You have a user who can't publish, but can create, for instance, web maps. They can upload files like CSVs or PDFs, etc. And then you have a viewer, which is a completely read-only user that is not allowed to modify anything. Basically, they can just see things that they have access to. And then on top of that, we have privileges or fine-grained privileges, which you can put together to create custom roles if none of these 5 built-in roles will actually work for you. And so you can take these 40 or 50 or so privileges that we have, and you can put them together and create a role and then assign it to users. And so in the REST API here on the right, you'll see for when you actually look at a user's resource, you'll see a long list of privileges of what they can and can't do. And so in your application, for instance, you can actually determine whether the user can or can't do certain actions in your user interface, and you can gray things out, or you can or show different user experiences for that particular user. And then finally, we have groups. Groups are ways that you can share items with other users. So they basically contain users and items, and any user within the group can see or access any item within that group. So you can create these project groups, let's call them, where you can share all the items that you're working on as a group, and then everybody else can see them. Groups themselves have visibility, so they can be shared to no one, or shared to the organization, or shared to everyone. But that's really about the group itself. The items within the group don't inherit that visibility or that sharing. The control of who sees the item is still with the owner. So if you create a public group, but the owner who is sharing their information to that group does not make it public, then someone anonymously seeing that group will not be able to see any of the items which are not also shared to the public. Something to understand. So the control, as I said, is to the owner of the group. The other thing that you can do with groups is the owner of the group, can actually share content that they have access to into the group to create collections. So this is especially useful if you're maintaining, let's say, a list of items that are important to your particular project or have a certain theme, etc., and then you can share the group to other people for them to go there and discover this particular content that you want them to see. This is the way, for instance, that we do the Living Atlas. The Living Atlas is a group that we are curating and pulling in or sharing items into it to collect them in such a way that when someone goes to this Living Atlas group, they can see all the wonderful content that we've accumulated together, or that we've highlighted in that group. There's a special type of group that we call a group with update capabilities. So regular groups only allow other users to see the items, to be able to read them. Groups with update capabilities allow all members of that group to be able to actually modify the items. So they are able to go and change the web map that's in that group, or modify title and description, etc., of the particular item. Because of that power, there's additional restrictions on these types of groups. These types of groups can only be created by administrators within the organization. They can only contain items and users that are within that organization. And once you create them, you cannot toggle that property on and off. So you can't make a regular group into a group with update capabilities because that would be changing the contract between you, the group creator, and everybody else who's shared something already into that group. So these groups are especially useful for collaborative editing, shift operators. So, if you have emergency operations, you have multiple shift, people come and go, but they all need to be working on the same exact items and maps together. So this comes in handy with that. And then, as I said, with collaborative editing, they also are very useful. So let's talk a little bit about feature layer editing and security. One powerful feature with ArcGIS Online is our feature layers and the ability to create these layers and then allow other people to edit and provide information and have people go into the field and be able to collect data and store it all into these layers. Now, one thing to understand is that the feature layer itself has this editing ability that you can enable, but by default, there are certain types of users that can always edit a feature layer, even with that editing capability off. One is the owner who created the feature layer, so they can always edit their own stuff. Admins of that organization in which the feature layer is can also edit their own the feature layer. And then any members of these groups with update capabilities I just mentioned in the previous slide can also always edit. So if you need any of those people to be able to change anything in the feature layer or add any features, they can always do that. You enable editing if you want anybody else who has access to that feature layer to be able to edit or to change features. That means that if the feature layer itself, the item, is shared to the organization, for instance, anybody within the organization can start editing that feature layer if you have editing on. If you actually share that out to the public, then it means anonymous users are able to do editing on that feature layer, which is sometimes desirable, lots of times not so desirable. So something to be careful of when you enable editing. Let's make sure that the item is not public unless you really want it to be public. Now, once you enable editing, you can then control what users are able to do. You can allow them to add, update, and delete features. You can just allow them to update or just add or only change certain attributes, etc. So we have a wide variety of combinations of things that you can do once editing is enabled to try to control what users can do on your feature layer. There's a concept on top of feature layers that we call feature layer views, which allows you even more control. So feature layer views are very much like database views. They provide a way to hide the underlying table or feature layer in this case, and to change the properties and only allow certain people or certain things to be done or viewed from that underlying data set. So you can create a feature layer view on top of a feature layer, and that looks to the outside as just another feature layer. But on top of that, you can then change how the feature layer is shared, the editing settings, the export settings, the filters, the metadata, and the time settings on that feature layer. So what you can do is you can create for instance, one feature layer that contains all your data, you can create a view that allows a set of field collectors to actually be collecting data into it and only maybe adding data and nothing else. Then you could have another feature layer view built on top of that feature layer that's shared out to a group of users who have full privileges to go in and clean up the data and approve it. And then maybe you have another feature layer view still built on that feature layer that allows the public to see only the features that have been approved by the previous group to be seen by the public and with no editing privileges. So you can create all these workflows and combinations with this without having to expose your data too widely or make it public, etc. Okay, now let's switch gears a little bit and talk a little bit about encryption. So on ArcGIS Online, we've set up the platform to do both encryption in transit and encryption at rest. So encryption in transit is about when things are going across the wire. So we've supported for a very long time HTTPS. And added not too long ago HSTS, which is a way to tell the browsers to always use HTTPS for any URLs on a particular domain, even though maybe your bookmarks are pointing to HTTP, etc. So we support HTTPS and HSTS. And at rest, we encrypt all the data that gets laid down in our back-end data stores of various kinds. So that's always encrypted. We do still support HTTP for transit for some older subscriptions. So subscriptions that are probably a year old and before have the option to only work or to switch off HTTPS and only allow allow a mix of HTTP and HTTPS. And so because of this, some organizations might be using mostly HTTP. So one thing that we wanted to sort of start giving out information on is that we are trying to upgrade our platform to be HTTPS only across all organizations on ArcGIS Online. Earlier last year, we switched our HTTPS implementation to only be TLS 1.2 as far as the protocol is concerned on HTTPS. This was to get in line with some best practices and get rid of some weak ciphers on the HTTPS transfer protocol. So we did that. Now the next step is that we want to move all our customers to be HTTPS to get in line with various directives from the government, the U.S. government and many other governments to make cloud platforms more secure. So we are planning currently in late September of this year to switch all organizations who previously were HTTP, allowed HTTP to be HTTPS only. So what does that mean for these organizations? Well, if you're using HTTP information in an HTTPS page, browsers will now basically block those calls because they're insecure. So once you, let's say, run your application or your map viewer under HTTPS, and if you're using your say, hosted services which are under HTTP, you will see some mixed content or some warnings and some failures. So that's the kind of thing that might start failing if you have references to HTTPS. We also are looking at redirecting HTTP to HTTPS as part of this, which means that clients that might have not supported HTTPS very much will fail to connect. So things like the Python API or much older Python APIs and other SDKs might run into issues if we redirect them to HTTPS. So those are a couple of places where we think there might be some issues. Now, if you created your organization recently, everything will be HTTPS anyway, with no options for you to disable it. But if you're an older organization, you should go to your organization pages, and if you see something like up here on the right, and you see this, it means that your organization doesn't have HTTPS on, and so you should try to switch it on and test your applications and validate that they still work. If everything works, then you're okay. Otherwise, you'll have to go through your information and try to figure out where you have HTTP references. Now, we have a tool that we call the Security Advisor, which Jeff is going to show a little bit later in this talk, that you can actually launch off of the trust.arcgis.com, which basically tries to go through your information and look for HTTP references that might be causing issues and flag them for you so you can go and see what you can do about those. Now, as we find more potential pitfalls for organizations, or as any schedule might change, we'll keep on putting information on trust.arcgis.com and blogs and other things. So keep an eye out for any announcements to do around this, especially on trust.arcgis.com. That's really the place to go to find out about any security-related information. Now a little bit on user administration and authentication. So as part of creating your organization, you will be, as an administrator, you will be adding users. So you can add users to your organization by either pre-creating the users with a username and password, and then providing them that in some form offline. You can also send them an email invitation with a pre-created username and ask them to select a password upon first login. You can also send them an email and ask them to completely create a new identity themselves, so they pick the username and the password. Or you can have them auto-join, depending on some external identity provider. And I'll talk about external identity providers a little bit later. But basically, if they get through your Active Directory or LDAP system that you might have, your Okta or whatever you might use in your enterprise, then automatically have them join your organization. Now, administrators in the organization are, as I said before, very powerful users. They can manage everything. Obviously, they can manage the organizational properties, but they can also manage licenses and user types. They can manage everybody's item groups and profiles. They can disable and delete the users in addition to adding them. They can reset users' passwords, and they can change users' roles. So those are some of the things that the admins can do, but they are basically the managers of the organization and can do anything. Now, there are different ways that you can authenticate with ArcGIS Online, and as an organization, you can select what you want to allow your users to authenticate with. So the first option is what we call ArcGIS accounts. These are username and passwords that are stored in our system. They are created by the users who are coming in and joining your organization, or that you pre-create. So those live in our system, and with those you have a few additional options. It's just username and password. You can enable multi-factor authentication on your users, so that your users will need to add a second factor, which is usually something that you run on your smartphone, like a Google Authenticator or Microsoft Authenticator, which will provide these temporary numbers that the user then has to log in with, or provide in addition to their password. You can also have a password policy for your organization, so you can select your length, your complexity, expiration of passwords, and the history requirements of passwords. So you can say users need to have 12 character long passwords with upper and lowercase and numbers, and every 90 days they need to change their password, and they can't reuse the last 5 that they used. So, as an example. A second way that your users can authenticate is using social identities. So we currently support Google and Facebook as a way for users to log in. In our next release, we are adding GitHub as a way to authenticate. And it's the administrator, though, that can enable this ability or not. So you might not want to have social identities be able to log in to your organization, but you might. So you can enable or disable that option. And then finally, you can integrate ArcGIS Online with your enterprise identity provider. So if you have a SAML 2.0 compliant identity provider, what you can do is you can set it up with ArcGIS Online, and ArcGIS Online, when your users log in, will redirect your users to your identity provider for them to log in. Once they've logged in successfully, then there'll be a trusted exchange back to ArcGIS Online to allow that user into the organization. We have documentation on how to set up the most popular identity providers out there, SAML 2.0 identity providers, things like ADFS, NetIQ, Shibboleth, and so on. But there's more out there that can also be integrated with online. Once your users are authenticated by your identity provider, you can have them automatically be logged in, or you can only allow the ones that were invited to your organization to log in. You can mix and match your identities, so you can have ArcGIS accounts log in along with enterprise identities. So for instance, you could have your employees log in with your identity provider, whereas contractors could be using ArcGIS accounts or even social identities. And finally, we also support enterprise groups. So you can associate a group in your Active Directory, for instance, with an online group. And when a user from that group logs in using your identity provider, will automatically put them into the group on ArcGIS Online, which is useful to keep online in sync with your Active Directory list of users. Okay, I'll hand it over to Jeff to show a little bit how you set this up and give you a little bit more information about this.
Thanks, Andrea. Now I want to demonstrate how to configure ArcGIS Online with an enterprise identity provider. So let me jump out of this and go to my sample ArcGIS Online org here. Now I'm logged in as an administrator. So to configure this, I want to click on Organization, Settings, Security. And scroll down a little bit. We've got under logins here, we've got an option to set the enterprise login. So this is a two-step process. The first step is to configure the enterprise login. So I'll click on this button. I get to choose between a one identity provider or a federation of identity providers. In this case, I'll just choose one. I'll give it a name. ADFS is the identity provider I'm going to demonstrate this with. I will select choose. Users can join either automatically or upon invitation. If you choose automatically, you need to have predefined a default role for new members. I've already done that here. New users will be viewers in my organization. And now I need to provide the metadata source for the identity provider. I've got it saved in a file. I'll browse to that file here. And now there's some advanced settings that I want to show you. You may or may not have to adjust this. I'm using ADFS, and in this case, I want to enable the signed request. I want to enable the SHA-256 encryption. I want to enable the propagate logout to identity provider. This means when a user logs out from ArcGIS Online, they are also logged out from the identity provider. And lastly, I want to enable the SAML-based group membership. I'll get to this shortly in a, actually I'll demonstrate this in my example here. I've already created a group linked to an enterprise group within my identity provider. So I'm going to select these and hit save. Everything looks good. Now the second step is to download the service provider metadata. When you click on that, it generates a file for you. You save this file. This file you need to give to your IT department or whoever's in charge of the identity provider, because they need to go into that. They need to import this file. This is a way of registering your ArcGIS Online organization with the identity provider, so they know. So they're expecting the communication between the two. In this case, I've already done that, so I'm not going to save this. I'm going to cancel. And now it's saved automatically. So when I sign out, and now my login screen, I've got an option. I can choose my ArcGIS login. This is my administrator account that I created. Or I can choose the enterprise login. When I click the ADFS on the enterprise login, I get redirected to a sign-in page on my internal identity provider. Now this is an advantage for enterprise identity providers, is the fact that the IDP or the identity provider does not need to communicate directly with ArcGIS Online. In this case, the user that's logging in needs to be able to communicate with Online and the identity provider, but direct communication is not required. So now I'm going to sign in with a sample account here. In this case, this account is brand new. The new user is taken to the edit profile page to allow a user to update, perhaps put in a picture, update the bio, anything like that. Notice the role for this user is viewer. That's the default role I had configured. And now we are logged in. Now the example, I mentioned the groups. I had created a group previously called AGS users, and this user, brand new user, just logged in, they're automatically assigned to this group. This AGS users group I had linked to an enterprise group prior to login. So this happened automatically since I enabled the enterprise group option when configuring the enterprise identity provider. I'll pass it back over to you, Andrea.
Okay, now let's talk a little bit about how to integrate your applications with ArcGIS Online. So you might want to provide additional functionality in your applications for users that are using ArcGIS Online to extend what they can do. So you want to integrate ArcGIS Online identities into your own application so that users can log in, and then the application can then use their content, for instance, to further do other things in the application. So to do this, you use something called OAuth 2.0. So we support OAuth 2.0, which is a way of handling authentication decisions between web and server. So you can basically bring up the sign-in dialog from ArcGIS Online, allow users to log in, and then hand that control back to the application to do whatever the application does. So there's two ways of doing this. So one is if you're integrating with a web application, like a JavaScript API application that you've written, you first of all register your application with ArcGIS Online, which gives you a client ID, and you then redirect in your application to the sign-in dialog for ArcGIS Online using that client ID. That sign-in dialog will then redirect back, once the user has authenticated, will redirect back to your application using a redirect URI that you've registered when you registered the application, and hand back to the application a token, an authentication token, which then allows the application to act on behalf of the user. So using our REST API, you send the token to our REST API, and that tells us who the user is or who the caller is. And then depending on who it is and what they have access to, then we'll send back the answer. So you can then use it to maybe create new content or analyze content that they own privately and have not shared with a wider group. There's a second scenario where if you have maybe more of a native app, what you can do is you can register your app, but now when you send the user to log in and get redirected back, you get back a refresh token. A refresh token represents the user for a longer time so that you can store that refresh token. And using that refresh token, you can get an authentication token or an access token like we had in the previous case. And then use that access token to then make calls on the REST API to do whatever the application needs. In this way, you don't have to ask the user to log in so often. It's better for applications that need to have the user logged in for a longer period of time, but at the same time need to store this refresh token a little bit longer and securely, because it basically represents the user for a much longer period of time. So let me hand it off to Jeff again, so he can show you a little bit on how to integrate this and a few other options.
Thanks, Andrea. All right, I'm going to give a brief demonstration of registering a web application. The easiest way to show this, Let me log out of this. Open up a new tab. Now I've got a web app builder application that I have saved and downloaded onto my laptop right here. It's called California Airports. When I click on it, you notice I've got a sign-in window that asks me to sign into ArcGIS Online because one of the services I'm accessing is an ArcGIS Online service. Now this is great this is okay if you're using ArcGIS accounts. If you're using enterprise accounts, you don't have the option right now to sign in with an enterprise account, so this is somewhat limited. For example, if I wanted to sign in with the account that I created earlier, that ArcGIS user account, I wouldn't be able to do that right here. What I need to do is register the web application with ArcGIS Online. So let me sign in as my administrator account right here. Now if I go to Content and Add Item, in this case I want to add an application. So web mapping application, everything will leave the default right here. For the URL, I'm going to put in the URL that I've got right here. Copy this. That's my web application URL. Paste that. Title, we'll call this California Airports. Tags, give it some tags. And we'll add the item. Now we're not done yet. This added the item, added the appropriate URL. Under Settings, if we scroll down to the bottom here, we've got an option for app registration. This is where I need to click Register. And when I click Register the app, I need to provide a redirect URI. This is the same URL in order to access the app. So I'll copy that same URL, click Add, it gets added down here, and I click Register. And what this does, this registers the app with ArcGIS Online and provides me an app ID. The app ID is what I need to copy and use within my application. So I've got a config.js file within the application that I need to edit. I've already opened it up previously, so I've got it in my notepad right here. Under app ID, I'm going to paste that app ID there. Click Save. Go ahead and minimize that. Now let's go ahead and log out of here. Go back to my I'm going to refresh this. Now I get a little prompt to ask me to sign into ArcGIS Online. Click OK here, and I get a pop-up window that shows me the login dialog. Now I can choose, again here I can log in with an ArcGIS account if I wanted to, but why I chose to register the app was to allow me to log in with an enterprise account via SAML. I'll click ADFS. I'm going to go through and access with that same user. And now the application appears. I can access it. Everything's great. So that's the advantage of that's a good example of why you would want to register a web application with ArcGIS Online. So let's jump back to the slides here. The next thing I want to talk about is some of the security configurations within the organization settings within your ArcGIS Online organization. If you go to Organization and Settings in the Security tab, at the top of the page you've got some options here I want to discuss. One of them is the Allow Anonymous Access. This by default is turned off. What does this mean? It means an anonymous user accessing your organization is required to log in before they can search for or access any content within your organization. Maybe that's what you want, maybe that's not. It's up to you. It's up to who you envision your audience or your users to be. If you are creating web maps and apps that you want to allow users, complete strangers without user IDs to be able to access, then you may want to enable the anonymous access. If you know that your users are going to be within your organization and you want to force them to log in before they gain access to anything, then you'd want to leave this disabled. Now, a couple other options here. You see that display an option in your sign-in panel to allow other members or to allow members of other organizations to sign in. Depends on who your users, which organization, or who your primary users are that you for your web maps and apps. Another option to edit biographical information. The sharing and search options are important. A critical one is to select whether or not you want your members to share content publicly. This kind of goes in line with the anonymous access. If you've allowed anonymous access and you also allow users to share content publicly, that means potentially they could publish a feature service with editing capabilities, share that publicly, and allow anyone to edit the feature service. That in some scenarios that could be dangerous depending on what sort of restrictions or what sort of access you've granted for editing. For example, if you allow a feature service with add, update, and delete capabilities, and you share it with everyone, an anonymous user could conceivably go in and update all the data or go as far as delete all the data. That's something that you need to determine at an organization level what you want to have allowed. Another option, of course, to search content outside the organization, you can restrict that. You can also determine whether or not you want users to be able to log in using social media or show the social media links on the items and groups if you want them to share it through Facebook or some other social media. Another option is allow portal access. If you have secured services within your ArcGIS Online and you've got another ArcGIS Enterprise installed on inside your internal network, and you want web apps within ArcGIS Enterprise to be able to access secured services from ArcGIS Online, you will need to enable and add this allow portal access. This is disabled by default and means only built-in users or ArcGIS users would have access to the secured services. This is very similar to what I demonstrated previously there with the downloaded application being able to access ArcGIS Online. If you don't enable or do not allow portal access, then a web app on your ArcGIS Enterprise would only be able to access secured services in ArcGIS Online with an ArcGIS account, not an Enterprise or SAML account. So this is another diagram showing what I was describing there, where you've got your ArcGIS Enterprise on the left-hand side accessing a secured service in ArcGIS Online. If you're using SAML, you need to enable the allow portal access. Now for the allowed origins, this comes into play if you're using JavaScript applications. A lot of applications are JavaScript based, and the CORS restrictions is a common way to try to minimize or restrict which applications can make CORS requests to your ArcGIS Online items or services. This isn't a restriction that would prevent users from viewing services in ArcGIS Online. This is just comes into play for a CORS request, which is primarily done if you're going to be editing a feature service, as an example. A CORS request would be required from the web application in order to edit an ArcGIS Online feature service. So you can add specific web application or application domains where the web applications reside. By default, if there's nothing there, CORS is open to everyone. So it is common practice to put in, if you know where your web applications are that are going to be accessing any secured services in ArcGIS Online, it is recommended to put in their domain names right here. And again, as an example of how a CORS request works, as I mentioned before, it's for JavaScript applications. So you've got your client browser on top. Your web application is hosted on an external server, and your services are secured services in ArcGIS Online. So the client browser goes to the web application, the JavaScript web application, and a request is being made to a secured ArcGIS Online service. Oftentimes these are CORS requests, and that's where the CORS restrictions would come into play. Now, a new option that I want to demonstrate for you is the ArcGIS Online Security Advisor. There are lots of different security settings within your ArcGIS Online organization, and sometimes it's hard to keep track or know if a change has happened, or perhaps review recommendations from us. So what we've got is we've developed a tool, an ArcGIS Online Security Advisor, that can be accessed if you go to trust.arcgis.com. And it does require, to use this, it requires an ArcGIS Online administrator account. So let me give you a brief demonstration of what this looks like. So if I open up my browser and go to trust.arcgis.com, you'll notice up here at the top right is a Launch Security Advisor. I'm going to click on that, click Sign In, and like I mentioned before, I need to sign in as an administrator. What this does a quick scan of some of your ArcGIS Online organization security settings, and it sort of flags anything that you might want to look at. Now, these are not required changes. These are just, in some cases, things to keep in mind, or best practice. A lot of it's going to vary depending on your organization. But for example, each of these are divided up. Here's some policies. It flags whether or not you've got HTTPS only access, anonymous access enabled, standardized queries, and such. Notice the green indicates that everything's okay. The orange indicates that there's some warnings and should be reviewed. If I go to sharing and searching, notice I do have the publicly share option enabled. And maybe that's okay, maybe that's what you want for organization. But this is a good way, a nice, easy endpoint to go to and check on a regular basis to make sure your settings haven't changed. It does give you a pretty good description too of each of these settings and possible recommendations for it. My password policy, for example, I've got everything enabled here except for I have not defined a password expiration or password reuse policy. There's some other factors here. As I said, this is just a report that you can review. You cannot make any changes within this endpoint. You can take a look at member logs if you're logging users. I don't have anything there right now. Organization logs show some of the administrative updates that have taken place, show timestamps for them, and the current status for some of these, and actually where that place or that request originated from. An important one here with the changed for the updated HTTPS only coming up later this year. If you have any references within items or service references within your organization that reference via HTTP, this will actually scan and give you a report of those items. In my case, my organization, I don't have any, so nothing appears here, but this is could be a good endpoint to go to verify. Make sure you're ready before we make that final transition to HTTPS only later this year. So I'm going to go ahead and transfer this. Go ahead and back to you, Andrea.
Okay, and a few final things. So as an administrator who wants to keep track of what's going on in their organization, there's a few ways of doing this. So first, there is something that we call the status reports. So there's a status tab in your organizational pages that allow you to see what's going on in your organization as far as credit consumption, content, applications, the members, what they're doing, groups, and so on. So you can get some visibility into usage and how much usage. Is there a lot of usage, not much usage? Are things, am I being charged a lot of credits or not, etc. We also have an activity log, so an administrator is able to download the activity log as a CSV file. And this shows or tracks any change made to the organization. So anytime a item is added, deleted, anytime a new user is created, anytime logins are made or failed logins happen, and so on. So there's various things that get logged in the activity log, and as an administrator, you can then export that and analyze it. A lot of security teams have security appliances that will look at that information, and you can create rules around it. It also does track IP addresses of these events so that you can then maybe relate them to blacklists and other things that you might have. So there's various uses for this activity log. The other use especially is for trying to understand what happened to certain layers and items, who deleted something that wasn't supposed to be deleted, those kinds of things. And then finally, a little bit about compliance. ArcGIS Online runs on world-class cloud infrastructure providers. We run both on Microsoft Azure and Amazon Web Services. These are providers that have various certifications and compliance levels like SOC and ISO 27000 and 27001, FedRAMP, Moderate, and so forth. On top of that, we've done our own validation for GDPR and what used to be Privacy Shield before that. So we have some documentation around that. We also get a yearly audit for FedRAMP. So we are FedRAMP, what's called FedRAMP tailored for low impact software as a service. That's our compliance level for FedRAMP. This is a U.S. federal government compliance framework that we currently abide to. It's similar to others that are seen around the world. And so we have this FedRAMP audit every year in which we get audited for our security and privacy controls. Your security team can find much more information about security of our products in general, not only online, on trust.arcgis.com. That's the first thing you should go and check out. We also have something called the Cloud Security Alliance questionnaire, which is we've collected a set of standard questions about security into one place. You can download them, you can review them. It's quite large. It's a big spreadsheet of these questions and answers, and you can give it to your security teams to review as far as for trusting ArcGIS Online. And if you have any questions, you can go to trust.arcgis.com, and there's links there to send in questions and find out more information if you need it. That concludes this concludes this presentation. I think if you have any questions, I think good places to go, as I said, Trust. Also, our GeoNet site is a good place to ask for questions, and I'll close it there. Thank you.